Welcome back to True Faith. We have a guest on today who's going to discuss evidence with reference to religion. He's been teaching maths, science and religion for 40 years. He has a Bachelor of Science with honours and a teaching diploma. So I'll hand you on to Micheál Ó Fearghail now.
We should start by being very clear about our words and what they mean. And half the problems nowadays is people throw around words and they haven't really stopped to think what they mean. Whereas the way to get somewhere with discussions is define your words and then use the laws of logic to see where it takes you. Now there's two words that people use. How can you prove something and what's the evidence for something? And this is how I want us to use these words. You can use proof for logical things. You can prove that in our what we call Euclidean space, which is the way we normally think of space, that the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, and you can prove it, and there's no fuss about that. That's logical things that are in the mind and in the intellect. When you come to actual objects in the world, as they famously said in the old days, contra factum non argumentum, you cannot argue with a fact. Now, for evidence, people once again, they use this word in different ways, and some people won't call it evidence unless they accept it. That just gets you into a stupid argument. What I want to say is evidence is an alleged fact which can be used to build other assumptions and other knowledge from. So when I say evidence about something, I'm not jumping to the conclusion that it's correct. This brings us to the next thing. We often use proof in the sense of accepting the evidence. That's what I'm trying to say. And some people will accept a piece of data as evidence and others won't. So when we talk about, our basic beliefs about what's in the world and maybe what's beyond the world, what we're talking about is not proving, we're talking about accepting the evidence. Now, if we will accept that, then we can talk intelligently. Another two words that we need to think about are belief and knowledge. What's the difference between knowledge and belief? And defining knowledge is actually much harder than would meet the eye. The reason is that the best definition perhaps that can be given is knowledge is true belief, but how do you know it's true? That's the whole problem. Now, some people will say, well, you just believe in God and angels and all that sort of thing, but we have knowledge about science. I deny that. For example, our chemistry and our general science is based on atoms and how they behave. Now, I have no doubt that there really are atoms and that they do behave pretty well the way that our modern so-called standard model describes. It's an extremely, extremely powerful and accurate description of the world as we have it. But we don't know that there are atoms. We believe there are atoms. Nobody has seen an atom. Some people have seen a blob on a screen. Yeah, sure. They've seen a blob on a screen. They haven't seen an atom. They believe it's an atom. Now, I would like people just to face up to the fact that everything in our life is based on belief, and knowledge, as we call it, means belief that we believe is true. So knowledge and belief are pretty well the same thing. If you believe in God, then He knows what's really around, and He knows which of our beliefs are true, and therefore which are knowledge and which are misconceptions. Now, our store of knowledge about the physical world took a huge, huge leap forward when the scientific method was invented or discovered, or whatever you want to call it. And Bacon was the first one. And the basic tool that we have is the controlled experiment. You see something happen, and you think it happens a certain way, but now we have worked out a way to check it. If I could give an example, the Romans discovered crystals of quartz on top of the Alps, and they thought that these crystals were ice that had frozen so hard on that really, really cold part of the world that they'd frozen solid for good, and that was that. Well, now, they didn't think to test it. They could have brought it down to Rome and just seen what would happen. They could have tried different things. And I won't go into a whole detail about the controlled experiment, but for example, if you want to know whether a certain plant needs more phosphorus, what you do is you get samples of the plant as identical as you possibly can. You put them in two separate places, or you put them in two separate containers, one with phosphorus and one without phosphorus. And if there is a difference, if everything else has been the same, then you know it is due to the phosphorus. Now that's extremely powerful. And Bacon believed, towards the end of the Middle Ages, that by that kind of process we would soon discern what the real laws of nature actually are. That's called the process of induction. You make observations, and from there you deduce the reasons for them. But there are two important problems with that method. The first is that with the development of our civilization, people are tending to forget that the scientific method only works in a certain limited set of circumstances. It works for things which actually are always repeatable, as far as we know. And there are other things in life that do not subject themselves to the scientific method. For example, all the things to do with the mind. The second problem is a very, very serious one, and that is that induction doesn't actually work. This was discussed by Christians, but it wasn't perhaps until Karl Popper came along, who was in the mid-20th century, and he was a highly respected scientist, philosopher of science, and he pointed out that it doesn't actually work. All that you can do is you can make tentative rules, and you can say, as far as we know, this is what always happens, but you can never use the scientific method to say, this can't happen, because if it does happen, contra factum non argumentum. There is no arguing with a fact, and what we do with science is 1,000 experiments can give us an idea of the laws of science, but just one reliable contrary experiment means we have to go back and start again, or at least modify it. And this has happened in history, in the history of science, and it'll probably happen again. So the reason I'm saying all this is I want to put to rest these confident statements of people. Miracles can't happen because they're against the laws of nature. Okay? Who told us that we have the entire rule book? Who told us that there isn't a law that only operates very infrequently and therefore is part of the possible thing? So now, as the great writer G.K. Chesterton pointed out once, if a peasant says that he saw something, say a miracle, and if you disbelieve him, there's only two reasons you would disbelieve him. One is that he's only a peasant, which turns you into a snob, or because you've already decided that all miracles are impossible. And Chesterton says, if you wish to believe that, well, that's up to you to do that, but you are the one who are being the dogmatist, not the Christian. I haven't yet jumped ahead to say, oh, it's God who's done this, or Our Lady, or anything like that. I'm merely pointing out that there are some things that happen which are not within the ambit of what we call mainstream science. And it is no good to say, this can't happen because we know the laws of nature, because I've just explained, you have to include all the evidence. You can't reject something because you've already decided it can't be true. You've got to check the evidence, check whether it's a reliable source or not. The second piece of evidence that I will present is the Shroud of Turin, which many believe to be the actual winding sheet of Christ. Now this has been examined very carefully during the last 50, 60, 70 years, and even before that. And there are people who reject it, but they are doing it against the evidence. If this had been anybody else but Jesus Christ, there wouldn't have been any problems about it whatsoever. And many, many people will repeat the story that it was carbon dated and it was dated to the Middle Ages. Well, if you check your actual facts, you will find that there was a protocol for that set of tests, and it was a very sensible protocol, and not one of the items of the protocol was actually followed in practice. Murphy's Law if something can go wrong, it will, was given carte blanche to happen. And what they did was they took a sample. They should have taken 3 samples from 3 different parts of the cloth. They took just one, and they took a piece that included a piece that had been patched onto it in the Middle Ages by a system known very well to the people of those days called invisible stitching. And therefore, that particular experiment is invalid. Now, there are hundreds of other bits of individual evidence that all point to this cloth being from the 1st century. That includes things like what the actual cloth is made of. There have now been much more accurate carbon dating, which can be done now with just a microgram of stuff, not a piece like a postage stamp, since science has developed so far. And all of these things point to a place in the Middle East from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD. The pollen that's found on the cloth completely matches the history that we know of the cloth, that it started in the Middle East and was taken up to Edessa in Turkey, and it's been to other places. Pollen from those places is on the shroud and not other kinds of pollen. From the feet, from where the feet were, samples of dust have been taken, and the dust has been identified as the same as the kind of dust that you would find in the Middle East. And that's even before we start talking about the image. The image itself doesn't bear any relationship whatsoever to any painting that is known. Most definitely no painting before the Renaissance, when things became very much more accurate and lifelike. If you look at the actual medieval paintings, they look like child's drawings compared with the image on the shroud. And in fact, the image is so faithful that it's subjected to forensic analysis like any other piece of forensic analysis, and we have learnt more things about crucifixion than we actually knew. Now, if you want to find more about that, it's on the internet. Look it up. Don't just look up things that are debunking it, if you don't mind. Look at both sides if you haven't heard of these things before. And I'll say no more than that about the shroud. The third item of evidence that I'll present is the miracle of the sun at Fatima that happened on the 13th of May, 1917. Once again, people will try to deny this, but every single objection can be overruled. It's almost as if heaven this time cornered people so that you simply can't deny it. For those who don't know what happened, 3 small children in Portugal reported that they'd seen a beautiful lady who told them certain things. And at first she didn't say who she was, but she did say she was from heaven. And in July of that year, she said that later on October the 13th, at midday, she would perform a miracle so that all might believe. Those were her words. Because of this, and because it was months ahead, the word spread about it, and tens of thousands of people trooped through days and days of rain to get to the place where they heard that the miracle would be. They didn't know what it was going to be, but they were expecting something. Now, the estimates of the people vary between 50,000 and 100,000. It's notoriously difficult to get numbers, especially as people will be even unconsciously biased. But the reliable evidence, as far as we have, would give 70,000 as a reasonable number of people. Now, everybody waited for midday, and at midday, nothing happened. What did happen was 1 hour later, at 1 p.m., and it was only afterwards people realized that because of summertime, the sun was actually at its zenith at 1 o'clock, not 12 o'clock. And that's even one more thing. Now, what they actually saw for 15 minutes, they saw the sun change colour and dance around in the sky. And then they saw it plunging towards the earth. People were convinced it was the end of the world. Some people were grovelling on the ground and screaming. Others were standing up and said, "Oh God, how great is your power." And at the end of that time, the sun seemed to go back to its place in the sky, and that was the end of it. Now, the objections to it. People say, Well, they were expecting to see something, and so they did. But it didn't happen when they expected it. It happened an hour later when people had already started to go home. And secondly, it was seen in another village about 12 miles away, where they most certainly were not expecting to see anything like this. So it's not that they were expecting it. Some people have even said, oh, they just looked at the sun and they saw spots before their eyes. Oh, now, excuse me, give us a break. You know, that's infants. That's infant school talk. They saw far more than that. They say it was just imagination, but their clothes were dried. They'd been soaked after hours and hours of rain. At the end of it, not only were their clothes, but the ground was not only dry but warm, and that is testified. People say, oh, they wanted to believe it, and so they're saying it. But you see, the Masonic government was really keen to debunk this whole thing, and so they sent a journalist from the Masonic newspaper, O Secolo, which means the world, and he was there and he saw it, and he had to report what he saw. These things were seen. Then people say, oh, but it can't be an astronomical observation because it wasn't seen anywhere else. Yeah, okay, so that proves it wasn't a normal thing. That's the whole point. It was something different. It was something real that had physical effects on people and on the ground. And it wasn't just the sun dancing. People say, oh, but the earth couldn't have stopped. We didn't say that. All we said is this happened. And it was proof that there is more in this universe than we understand. There is no way we can get our minds around what happened. And yet it did happen. It was seen by so many people. And these are 3 pieces of evidence from the modern world. I haven't even spoken about things thousands of years ago. I say that these are things that prove that there is more to this world than we imagine.
Thank you. That was Micheál Ó Fearghail. Hope you enjoyed this podcast. Don't forget to click a like and subscribe, as we'll have more content uploaded shortly. Thanks for listening.